So you'll see that step 6 is due on April 24th. For step 6, you'll be carrying out your behavior change project and actually implementing the single case design with a 5-day baseline phase and a 5-day intervention phase. You'll be monitoring the target behavior each of those days. And then for step 6, you're going to be writing a results and discussion section for your paper, adding them to the previous sections of your draft. And essentially, you'll be turning in an entire draft of your paper here for step 6. You've already written, as you remember, the introduction and method sections. Let's take a few minutes to look at each part of step 6, talk some about what you'll be doing for this step. So as a reminder, there's a template for your behavior change project paper. And this template describes what to include in each section of your paper. You've already written the introduction and method sections. For step 6, you'll be writing results and discussion sections. This template describes what to include in each of these sections. In the results section, which will be quite short, you're basically going to summarize using words the results that you'll be graphing, which I'll talk about in a minute. For the discussion section, you'll do a few things. First, reorient the reader to your study and summarize what the main aim of the study was and what your hypothesis was. So imagine that someone might be starting out reading your paper at the discussion. So remind them what the aim was, remind them what you predicted. Next, present your conclusion and evaluate whether the results that you collected and the data that you collected either support or fail to support your hypothesis. And that's really the core part of the discussion, when you interpret your data and make that decision. Again, we'll talk about how to visually inspect the data that you collect and plot on the single case design graph in a moment, and talk about how you might make that determination. So next, briefly discuss the implications of that conclusion. Does your conclusion fit with existing research? Why or why not? How might you explain the findings from your study? Why might they be important? Next, present some future directions. So given the study you ran and its results, what's the next step? Might we want to evaluate this intervention maybe with a larger group of people, or under different conditions, or for a different type of problem? And then finally, discuss any limitations of your study. And as a reminder, limitations are threats of the internal validity of the study. Again, the internal validity is the degree to which your study is free of confounds, meaning that you can draw a strong cause and effect conclusion. And then finally, any threats to external validity, or the degree to which you can generalize the findings of your study to other populations and other individuals. There's a good explanation of internal and external validity here at this link. And then finally, end with a brief summary of the conclusion that you drew. And as a reminder, also include a reference page. References start on the next page after your discussion ends. So let's talk some now about how to present the data that you collect as part of your study. So one option is to use the single case design graph that I have already provided for you. This is just a Word document. You can print this file out. You can complete this graph by hand, and then maybe take a picture of it and include that picture in your paper. As a reminder, you'll be adding the target behavior here to the y-axis of this graph. As you monitor the behavior for 5 days, apply your intervention, and then monitor the behavior for another 5 days. But if you'd prefer to be a little more tech savvy, I've created a template for your graph in Excel that you can use as well. So I'm going to show you how to use this template, and then we'll talk some about how to interpret the data you collect as part of this study. So if you open this template, you'll see that I've already created a graph for you. And all you have to do is enter the data that you collect when you assess your behavior. So let's, for example, say that my target behavior here is the number of grams of sugar I consume per day. So I changed the name of that dependent variable, essentially here in my study, the target behavior. Sugar consumption is operationalized by grams per day. And you'll notice that when I change that, the title of this graph changed. And then all I have to do in this template is simply enter the data that maybe I collected for each day. So at the end of the day, I monitored my sugar intake throughout the day, and maybe in a notebook I carried around with me, recorded the grams of sugar I had each day. So let's say that I was eating lots of sugar during the baseline phase, and I was just monitoring this behavior. You'll notice as I enter this data is plotted. And you'll see that during the baseline phase here of this study, my sugar consumption on a daily basis ranged between 50 and almost 70 grams per day. And then maybe I implemented some sort of intervention. Maybe if I kept my grams of sugar per day under a certain threshold, I then applied some sort of reward. And maybe the grams of sugar consumed per day look something more like this. So let's talk some now about how to interpret this graph and interpret the data that you collect. So one thing we could do is we could take the mean number, the mean grams of sugar consumed per day during the baseline phase and then during the intervention phase. That's something you might do when you describe your results in the results section of your paper. But what we're not going to do with the data that you collect as part of this project is run any sort of statistical analyses or tests on this data. Instead, we're going to draw a conclusion and determine whether these data here that I've collected, these results, determine whether these support or fail to support the hypothesis that I made. So let's imagine that the prediction I made as part of this study is that the contingency management intervention that I implement will reduce my sugar intake per day, such that there'll be lower sugar intake during the intervention phase of my study relative to the baseline phase of my study. Again, no intervention, intervention. So the way to evaluate these data and determine whether they support or fail to support the prediction is to simply visually inspect this graph. And there's two main things to look for here. First, is there a clear and notable change in the target behavior when the intervention is applied? And I think very clearly here, the answer to that question is yes. From day 5, no intervention, to day 6, intervention, there's a marked reduction in grams of sugar consumed per day. And then the second thing to look at is to determine whether that change in the target behavior that coincides with the application of the intervention is then maintained throughout the intervention phase. And the answer here also is a clear yes. So both of those criteria are met here. Notable marked reduction in the target behavior and change in the target behavior when immediately after the application of the intervention, and then that change is maintained throughout the entire intervention phase. So I think very, very clearly here, the conclusion that I would draw based on these results is that the data collected as part of this study support the prediction that a contingency management intervention would reduce daily sugar consumption. So again, you're looking for a notable marked change in the target behavior when the intervention is applied, and then maintenance of that change across time. So let's see how this data would look if the data did not support the prediction. So here, neither of those criteria are met. There is no notable obvious change when the intervention is applied, and no change that's maintained then throughout the entire intervention phase. So to summarize, for step 6, you're going to write a results and discussion section, a draft of those sections, add them to what you've already written. Be sure to have a reference section as well. You'll also be including a graph. Whether you complete it by hand, take a picture and paste it into the document, or you use the Excel template, and then copy this graph and paste it into your paper. Either way, be sure to include the graph as a figure. As a reminder, figures will appear after references. So I would have on the next page, I would paste in the figure and these data that I collected. We need to resize and whatnot. But now I have a pretty nice looking figure that I can include in my paper. If you have any questions about step 6, please email me. I'd be happy to address those questions. And as a reminder, I'll occasionally be available for phone or Zoom office hours. It's probably best if you just email me and set up an appointment. I'd be happy to chat with you. Talk to you later.